All right, guys, what's going on? Welcome back to the Everything College Football Podcast. Today, me and Nick here will be taking a dive into Colorado football, what the Buffaloes and Deion Sanders need to improve on most in 2024 to be a more competitive football program and to march forward with accomplishing that goal of reaching the postseason. Deion's first season saw them go 4-8. They lost games by an average margin of 14.5. That number was certainly largely skewed by massive losses to Oregon and Washington State. But this team battled hard, Nick. They lost 4 games by 1 score, one of them being a blown 29-point lead at home to Stanford. If there's any silver lining, I guess that's the one, right? I mean, that's certainly not something to be proud of, blowing that, especially at home. But this team battled. You've seen it early on in the year when they had, a nice start to the season, beating TCU on the road. They did very well against Nebraska. The Colorado State game was closer than it should have been, but again, they still battled. They didn't give up. They were down big to USC, ended up losing that one only by 7. UCLA was flat out dominating them, only lost that by 12. 7-point loss to Oregon State, 3-point loss to Arizona, and 1-score game against Utah. These scores, Nick, they're vastly different than what we saw in the past with Colorado. And I know they lost the games, right? They didn't win a game for the last 2 months, if that. But they battled hard even against some really good football programs.
This is a team that was very physical. They went out there and they certainly improved from where they were 2 years ago. They were 1-11 or 2 years ago. They were just a terrible team across the board, just a team that could not produce at all. They were dead last in many categories in college football, and now they certainly have improved under Deion Sanders. Anyone that thought they would be super competitive last year, being in the playoffs or being in a bowl game, definitely was a stretch. You and I both thought that a bowl game was a bit too far for this team. 4-8 is still a very respectable record considering where they were prior to that. I think it is a great turnaround early on, but there are still a lot of deficiencies across the board this team needs to address. Deion took care of some of the issues early on, but I think the defense still needs a lot of work, the offensive line as well. So I think there is a lot of work that has to be done with this team. It's baby steps at Colorado. It's a program that they're building from the ground floor. In the transfer portal NIL era, sure, they can go a little bit faster and get things done. So I was impressed with the progress early on, but they're going to still continue to slowly build with the way things are looking right now.
That's why, this program is so interesting for them. The scores are just read off to be able to compete like that against some of them with the issues they do have that we're going to address here. Ranked 13th in FBS, though, on 40-plus yard passing plays. Shedeur Sanders was 8th in completion rating, 10th in yards per game. I mean, he was great, right? We expected Shedeur to come over, as a former, 4-star recruit. He's not just Deion's son. This was a guy who was a very good quarterback, and he proved that. Very good passing attack that will only get better. We certainly weren't shocked. I think the numbers being that high is certainly a little unexpected, but I figured this would be an adequate group through the air. Biggest problem, though, is, they ranked second to last in sacks allowed. By far had the worst rushing attack in college football. I mean, this offense was as one-dimensional as it gets. And being able to score 28 points per game with this bad of an offensive line, I think was very impressive. 2.3 yards per carry, 69 yards per game on the ground. -7 rushing against Oregon State, 25 yards on 24 carries. Colorado State in the Oregon game, 25 carries each for 70 and 40 yards respectively. I mean, they didn't top over 70 yards at all in the first month of the season, or the first 4 games, that is. Ended up putting up 2 games of 100-plus yards, 193 against a terrible USC defense, and then Stanford in what was a shootout. They had 132 in. Next highest was 91 yards on 41 carries. I mean, this is as abysmal as it gets running the football, Nick. And, they tried to do it. I got to give them respect. They didn't completely abandon it. They had 7 games of 30-plus rushing attempts. They were 117th nationally in rush attempts per game. So they didn't always abandon it. I think that's very pure. This box score is as poor as it gets, especially versus good defenses. You're not going to be able to do anything. And they just got absolutely annihilated up front. You look at the UCLA game, couldn't run the ball, got pressured 27 times, 7 sacks allowed. As a team, they had an 11 PFF pass block grade. That's what you're going to start seeing more often here in the Big 12. Obviously, UCLA D-line is very special, but they can't compete like that, Nick, not one bit.
They absolutely cannot compete like that. 2.3 yards per carry is an atrociously bad number. Below 70 yards per game on the ground, dead last rush yards per game. If you want to be a competitive offense in this day and age, yes, you need to be able to throw the ball, and they have a quarterback that can do that in Shedeur Sanders. I think that's the first key piece they solved, was plugging a quarterback in there who was more than Deion's son. I think, people saying, oh, he's just Deion's kid. That's just a very disrespectful thing to say. He was very solid at Jackson State, and he came over and made it seamless transition. 27 touchdowns to 3 interceptions is a fantastic ratio. 3,200 yards passing, 69% comp rate. I mean, the kid can certainly throw the ball. He's a very talented quarterback. So they solved the first problem with the puzzle. They gave him some nice pieces to throw to. They had some really good wide receiving talent there, but the running back room, it had some talented pieces. They just could not make it work. They struggled to run the ball throughout the season, and that has been a big issue. If you want to be a competitive team in this day and age, you need to have balance on offense, and they had zero balance, just an absolutely one-dimensional mess. The offensive line certainly played a role in that, and they're going to have to continue to improve the offensive line if they want to have any sort of sustained success.
And that's what leads us to some of the pieces they're going to look to hopefully, the guys that are coming in can be an impact for them, kind of looking at this offensive line. Deion was highly critical, said they need to get better linemen, and he, had a pretty good offseason in doing so. They added 6 linemen via the portal, top-ranked Jordan Seaton, the 5-star prospect. They landed him, big-time addition there. Center Van Wells, right guard Landon Beebe. They're probably the best linemen they had, and they're now gone. One of the worst in the country, and left tackle Gerald Christian Lechan. He's now gone. That's good for them. They only returned 2 starters from a season ago, which could be a good thing or maybe even a bad thing if some of these new guys can't step up and be, plug-and-play guys. Jack Bailey, their left guard, he's still around. He was pretty adequate for them. Savion Washington at 6'8", 320, still a piece I think they like. Struggled a bit with higher competition, but overall the entire body of work, I thought this was a player who had some really impressive games, and especially as a pass protector, I think he can be an asset. He got absolutely whooped against UCLA, though, playing against some of the best in the country off the edge. So this is a player that needs to continue to progress. I think he's probably got some of the best ceiling of the young guys they have. Look at who they added, though. Philip Houston from FIU, 260 snaps 2 years ago. He was a full-time starter, nearly 700 snaps at right tackle. Immensely lacks size at 6'5", 250. Likely to serve as some depth. Curry Walker, he was UConn starting center. Wasn't anything special, but did play 100 snaps, so the experience factor is big, replacing Van Wells. Another guy significantly undersized, though, Nick, 6'1", 267. Khalil Benson, a left tackle from Indiana. He allowed the 3rd most pressures among Power 5 starters. He was a right tackle for Indiana, but he was right behind Colorado's left tackle, Christian Lehan, who, in terms of allowed pressures. So these 3 players right here, not exactly upgrades, Nick. What do you think the vision is? We're about to talk about some guys that are certainly going to be assets for this offensive line, but some of these other guys, including Walker, who's probably going to be the starting center, I mean, the size isn't there, and the production and playing, certainly has been very low amongst these players.
The size is certainly not there with Walker, which I think is concerning as a center there. The interior was an issue for this team. I think, Savion Washington definitely disappointed me. I really thought he could be a huge impact, but he still has a ton of potential, high ceiling at right tackle. I like what they can do with him. Jack Bailey, he's returning on the interior, but it doesn't entirely blow me away at left guard. I think he's a good player that does have some rotational ability to move around. Walker, 6'3", 267 out of UConn, 3 stars, a transfer, was a 3-star coming out of high school, didn't get a whole lot of love out of high school, was with a lot of smaller schools that looked at him. He looked good at time. The film is pretty decent, but the size of what concerns me, I do think he does have solid tape. Philip Houston's another guy. I do like the tape on Houston, a guy that really just did not have a lot of love coming out of high school, made a bit of a name for himself, playing a couple of reps here and there, looking good at FIU in those reps, 6'5", 250 for him. The size, again, an issue there. More of a rotational piece. You can kind of move around, kick him out when you need to. I think he's a solid piece to add. These are good depth rotational pieces, and considering that there are better players they added from the portal on top of that, it doesn't worry me as much. I think these are nice adds that Deion had to kind of round out his unit.
Amari Ward, he was denied transferring to Colorado last year due to academics from Jackson State, 6'4", 310. No experience there, but certainly a little bit of a boost in terms of size compared to these other guys. Things do get exciting here. An honorable mention, All-American left guard Justin Mayers, allowed 1 sack all year, was a great run blocker for UTEP. Only 6'3", 309, but the quality of play will certainly be, coveted. It should be a nice, significant boost there if they end up putting him at left guard. Obviously, again, Jake Bailey's returning. But all these positions are up for grabs. Tyler Johnson, I think, when I saw they landed him, I said, wow, what a get by Deion in Colorado. This has been one of the best, pass blockers in college football the last 2 years. Was great at right guard in 22. Kicked over to left guard in 23. It wasn't as sound, but he was still a pretty elite player for them. I think they're going to be very happy with the 6'5", 320. A guy that certainly has a great future for him. Jordan Seaton, this is the biggest surprise, being able to land the 5-star top-ranked interior offensive lineman, a guy who possesses quickness, agility, the ability to be a strong run blocker with his explosiveness. He needs to continue to bulk up, and he'll need to, grind to find some consistency. But he has the wingspan to play tackle. A day 1 starter, it appears, for Colorado. If these guys can't be plug and plays, though, Nick, it could certainly get worse for Colorado. That sometimes happens. When your bad players depart, it can always get worse. Caden Proctor, for example, last year, obviously he was in the SEC, but he was a 5-star freshman that struggled heavily. So it's going to be expected that Seton's not just going to come in here and be a highly impactful performer. Even if he does struggle, it's still an improvement, is it not?
I think Seton's a great add. His transfer or high school committing was kind of weird. Went through a different cycle. Was recruited by Alabama. All the big teams coming out of IMG Academy. Obviously, they have great pedigree, reducing players. Had that issue on social media. Some other things came up, but he ended up sticking it out with Colorado, signing at the end of the cycle. 6'5", 287. I think certainly got to work on the size, maybe just a little bit there, but he is a highly rated player for a reason. 247 has him the 17th ranked player in the class, number 1 offensive tackle in the class, a great player in the interior, a guy that's flexible. You saw him moved around a little bit at IMG. You saw they could play him where they needed to at different points. I think at Colorado, he's going to have an way to move him. An athletically gifted offensive lineman, great wingspan, a guy that's really solid. I like his feet as well. Footwork is pretty good, a good player. Originally hails from the Washington, D.C. area, ended up at IMG, a good fit there. Tyler Johnson, another player that's fantastic, right? A 4-star out of high school, who was a highly rated 4-star as well, coming out of Conroe, Texas, ended up staying in-state at Houston. It was a really good player for them, a great player at Houston, a really good opportunity for him. I think he's a guy that you can move around. He was a great top prospect in that class out of high school in Texas, and now he gets another shot here at Colorado. I think he takes a step up and can play for a bigger team and get some opportunities. Another guy that I think is very flexible. You can move him around and plug him and play in different situations. These are 2 very high impact adds for this Colorado team.
Bottom line for me on the offensive lines, I think they should really see a boost this year. Johnson and Mayers got to be slow. Seton being a 5-star, you got to throw him to the wolves. I think that's the best way to probably get him prepped to be the future of your program, especially since a lot of guys, other programs, are going to be throwing the money out there. Obviously, Deion Sanders is a guy that's going to be tough to out-recruit, but in terms of money and, upside, other guys can certainly offer him. Proctor, for example, just left for Iowa, going back home. Seton can certainly do that, so I think you got to get him out there early. Can't let him ride the bench. I think it's best for both parties. That's the bottom line for me, Nick. Does that go for you as well? Or do you think it's going to be much of the same? Think it's only going to be, maybe a 10 or 15% improvement? Or do you think you're going to see vast improvements that showcases a little bit more balance and a lot more protection?
Yeah, I think the floor is a 10% improvement. I think the ceiling's around a 30% improvement. I think there is room for improvement here, but I'm a little more bullish on that, a little more cautiously optimistic. I think Seton does have to play early on. I think there's no reason why to put him on the bench. If you're going to get him out of high school, I'm sure he got a nice deal when he committed to Colorado in terms of NIL. So I think you certainly got to get him in there early, let him get comfortable and learn. Proctor, he learned over time in the SEC, ended up being one of the best offensive linemen for Alabama towards the end of the season after a rough start. He looked really good in the Georgia game, so I think you might as well let him get out there and see what you can do with him.
Now looking at another big issue with Colorado is their defense. 2021, they weren't very good, and they had some nice players, and they ended up losing all those guys. So heading into 2022, I said this unit was going to absolutely get demolished. They allowed almost 45 points per game. They were dead last in almost every single category, meaning Deion Sanders had a heck of an overhaul to try and deal with. Obviously, this side of the ball is much harder to get into sync than the offensive side. Certainly been a work in progress for a couple years now, so I'm not shocked to see it be this poor. The defensive line added some good transfers last year. Good portion of them depart, though. Biggest problem for them is they just lack size tremendously up front. They added 7 defensive line/edge players in the portal. Some of the headliners, BJ Green, a great pickup. Impressive pass rusher from Arizona State. Kind of like Tyler Johnson when I seen I got this one. He was originally going to go to Washington, ends up here in Boulder. A guy who's a good, quick get off, really gets around the edge. I think he's going to be an important player for them. Keaton Wade, he was a 4-star coming out of come over from Kentucky. Samuel Ukulelen, quite impressive in a long year, in a nice year being in the rotation for Pittsburgh. I thought, quietly was a good player for them. 3 nice talents in those guys. I think Anquan Barnes, 6'5", 314. Teron Carter, 6'3", 300 from Alabama and Arkansas, respectively. Coming from the SEC, so they had some of that size that, they certainly need to continue to boost up in that area. Chidobe Nwankwo, he's been a great run defender for Houston the last 4 years. Sits at 5'11", he is 295 pounds. We'll see what kind of impact these guys have as a few they picked up last year weren't exactly stout for them like we envisioned. But guys like Jordan Dominic were highly impactful, as expected. And I think that some of the guys I just mentioned, like Green and Oklahoma, they're going to have to step up and they're going to have to be big. This team really struggled with size in the middle, Nick, and allowed them to get absolutely demolished against the run.
This team's size has been a big issue throughout all of last year. They got demolished against the run on the ground. They were not very strong on the interior. I think Carter, SEC experience for him coming over. I think that's a good player you can plug in there on the interior. A nice physical player. BJ Green, a great ad from Arizona State, a late ad in the cycle. Kind of shocked. I didn't really expect that to be a grab for Colorado. Green, a good physical player, great player out of high school. Looked good at Arizona State. Really solid film on him. I think he's a guy you can add and plug in. Keaton Wade at Kentucky, more SEC experience, certainly a little undersized, but a guy that I think has a lot of opportunities to succeed at the next level. I think Wade's a really good add in there who you can plug in early on. There's some other guys. Quincy Wiggins is another solid player from LSU. Anquan Barnes from Alabama, two guys SEC, limited SEC experience, but guys that could be really good for this team. So I think they've made some right moves early on, trying to address some issues. This is a team that was very bad, a lot of missed tackles, gave a ton of points per game, gave a ton of yards per game, especially through the air. They got dashed on the ground as well. They got to start beefing up the trenches. Certainly, I think Deion knows that, and he's going to continue to do that. This is an early start for him, adding some nice trench pieces, but they're going to have to continue to do that.
They showed the ability to be competitive at times. Against the run, against the Arizona State, they were very good. Didn't get absolutely brutalized against Washington State. They're pretty stout against Colorado State. Held USC, who's just awful, to 95 yards. Stanford only had a $124. So the run defense showed the ability to be competitive, but again, against some of these tougher opponents like Arizona, Utah, TCU, these teams are putting up, 5 to 7 yards per carry on them. That certainly needs to improve. Oregon, for example, had 240, 6.5 yards per touch. So in terms of competing against the better programs, much like the offensive line, they have to be able to, not just find better size, but better playmaking ability as well. But with this defense, I'm just not very hopeful for. They need help there in the middle, so they moved Trevor Woods. He struggled significantly in those last 4 games of this year he played. Still hard-hitting, instinctive playmaker. Should really grow in the offseason, I would say. The linebacking spot, I'm really not that all that helpful for. Their best player, again, Nick, Trevor Woods, a converted safety down to the middle. But the secondary overall has some impressive figures. They have 2 former number 1 CB recruits in Travis Hunter and Cormani McClain. Omarion Cooper was good at times for them. Shiloh Sanders was a nice asset at safety. Overall, though, scheming, communication, poor tackling all contributed to a horrid effort from this unit. And doing a lot better, I'd say, with a year under their belt. 277 yards per game allowed. Just a horrid figure, and you see that against Stanford. They're just getting tossed. Even Travis Hunter, 400 yards and 4 touchdowns allowed through the air. It was pretty easy to find yards throwing the ball against this Colorado defense, Nick. Improvement has to start somewhere, and I think with some of the newer bodies they got on the defensive line, certainly going to help. But they didn't really bring in much here in the secondary. I think Deion has confidence in these guys, and I do as well. But they have to scheme them up better. They have to, improve in those areas I just mentioned, like communication and some better fundamentals.
I think they have to get better fundamentals. Certainly, I think Sanders, Shiloh Sanders was really good for them. 70 total tackles, a pick, and 3 pass breakups for him. Travis Hunter was a really fun player to watch. 5 pass breakups, 3 picks, 30 total tackles for him across various appearances. Cormani McClain didn't have the best season, 13 tackles and 2 pass breakups. Need to see more of him. Trevor Woods, a good player, but I just don't really like the move for him at linebacker. I think he's a better defensive back than he is a linebacker. 56 total tackles, 2 interceptions, 3 pass breakups. A good player, though, a good leader, Trevor Woods. I'm glad they returned him. I'm just concerned about him at middle linebacker. I'm not entirely sure he's going to be up to snuff to compete. This is a team that they had to continue to bring in different players. They made a little bit of few moves here and there in the secondary, in the portal. Not an incredible amount of work compared to their offensive line, defensive line moves. They're going to learn. The scheme is going to get better. I think a lot of it has to be, reps there. You have to play with these guys over and over again. When you plug in a bunch of players and never played together, it's going to obviously be a bit tough early on. I think Sanders there in the secondary is a good piece. Travis Hunter, if he's going to play in the secondary, I think that's a great opportunity for him to continue to get reps. Of course, he has the more, the dual opportunity. Is he going to play wide receiver more this year? I think he should play more in the secondary. I think he's a better defensive player than he is an offensive player. That's just my opinion on what I've watched. I'd like to see Hunter get some more reps in the secondary than he does on offense.
Yeah, Cormani McClain, he wasn't very good last year, and I think Deion at one point early on in the year actually called him out. McClain, though, it looks like his work ethic is back up to par. I think it's certainly going to be improved for him. Amari McNeil, Arden Walker, 2 other guys we didn't mention on the D-line who were, adequate players for them. I think that, they rotated a lot on this D-line, but the best players they added from last year in the portal up front, those guys are departing, so I don't know. I think this defense will improve, Nick. Like you said, Trevor Woods, probably not the best fit for him. He was 205 pounds last year. Not sure what he's bulked up to. And when they post the spring roster, we'll see. But I'm sure it's not to the tune of a guy who's going to be a physical run stopper in the middle. So I think the linebacking position is very concerning, and it's going to put more pressure on this D line. I don't know. We'll see. I think, again, Colorado was very competitive last year, and these guys, they knew they were no good on this side of the ball, Nick, and again, they still went out and competed, and they held some pretty impressive opponents. Utah only 23 points, Oregon State only 26, UCLA, I thought they'd run the ball all over them, and they weren't able to do so. So I think they're going to compete, but right now, I'm not as hopeful for this side of the ball as I am the O-line. And these are things, like you said, baby steps for Colorado, but Deion, he's out there talking a big game where he needs a couple more dogs to be a competitive team to compete for a championship, and I just don't think that's true at this moment in time.
I just don't think it's true at this moment in time is either. I think like I keep saying, baby steps. Got to continue to slowly build this program. You're not going to be able to compete overnight on a program that was a bottom barrel program forever. The defense, I am not excited for the defense. The defense has a lot of issues they have to address, continue to address. I think they need to go out and get better linebacking talent. As much as I love Woods, and I've said that, I just don't think he really fits there with the size. Again, we got to look at what he looks like in the spring. But overall, I think they needed to address some more issues on the defense, specifically in the linebacking core and the secondary. The front part of the defense, the defensive line, will be a lot better, and the offensive line will be better. But I'm still concerned overall. This is a team that's a work in progress. Certainly, Deion, I think he's committed to building this team and getting them in the right direction. But to think that they're going to be competing, to win the conference this year or play, in an expanded playoff spot or anything like that is a little high. I think they got to get to a bowl game first.
Yep, new defensive coordinator Robert Livington. His post was Cincinnati Bengals secondary coach. Charles Kelly departed, so we'll see what kind of improvement he can have. I think I was looking for a little bit more in terms of new names added to this side of the ball. But I think trying to build that continuity is also important. We're bringing back names that are familiar with each other. Again, it's obviously very tough to build the defensive side of the ball. And it was a complete overhaul on the two deep. Everyone was new last year outside of Woods. So I think some of these guys coming back could be beneficial for them. We'll see, though. We'll talk about Colorado plenty this offseason. Going to be up for today's episode, Nick. Appreciate you joining me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Colorado, having a more returning ability, not having a lot of guys that are completely brand new to the system is going to help, certainly. But there's still a very much work in progress out there in Colorado and Boulder. They saw a lot of success early on, but they're going to have to continue to try and build and get that more success.
Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.